Welcome back to another episode of the Sport Management Office Hours. I'm Nick Zoroya.
Hey, and I'm Brandon Podgorski. Welcome. And we are excited to have Dr. Scott Grant with us today. So we're going to talk about all things NIL. We're going to take it from a little bit more of a broad view. We'll let Dr. Grant talk about his experience here in just a minute with his dealings with NIL. Interesting landscape with NIL and what's going on. When I was at my former institution, we had Scott come in. I don't know, it was probably about the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021, and talking about athletes branding themselves and getting ready for NIL opportunities. Now, I think some have done a really good job with that. And some of the unintended consequences that I think that go along with NIL are starting to kind of manifest themselves a little bit. The reason I thought about bringing Scott on is just a few weeks ago, what the kid from UNLV decided, I'm not going to play because I wasn't getting paid, or I'm not getting paid what I thought I was worth. So we might not get into the specific instances of those, but just kind of, an overview, especially with the laws. I think that's something that gets lost in this whole thing, how there's state laws that kind of drive the boat on some of this stuff. So Scott, welcome to the show, and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in the NIL space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. And I appreciate it anytime someone wants
Yeah.
to talk about NIL, because usually it's not, and they're like, oh my God, this is way too much. Long story short, I was a high school teacher, coach, AD for quite a few years. Went back and did my doctorate in educational policy and leadership studies. Again, all my research has always been on educational based athletics. My parents were both teachers, so it's been in my blood forever. I taught business, sport management for about 6 years, and then in 2019, my family and I moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I became the director of ops, outreach, and leadership development at UNC in their athletic department, which was great because, as you know, with NIL, that was the transition period coming in. So I got to sit through all these meetings and watch it from the ground up, just be like, none of the questions that were being asked, like what has evolved, that was never even on the agenda at that
Yeah.
point. So fast forward about 2.5 years later, and a third child that wasn't part of the move plan. We are now back in Ohio. I teach at the University of Findlay. I'm a chair of the graduate program in the College of Ed. And I still do consulting work across the country, primarily with high school NIL, which is a whole nother slice that we could dive into. But it's been great, blessed, super lucky to be involved and support people from understanding that perspective.
So let's start maybe just kind of from the beginning with
Yeah.
NIL, and just so this comes in about in 2020, right? The Supreme Court, I think, decides, we're going to kind of take some of the limits off what this is. And to me, being a former college coach and in AD, I wasn't wild about paying college athletes. At the same time, I did find something un-American with not being able to profit off your name, image, and likeness. So I'm okay with that. How has the landscape changed from when we decided first, okay, we can start athletes getting NIL? And I think at first it was just kind of thought of like, hey, we'll sell their jerseys in the bookstore and you get a cut. To now, I mean, we've got collectives. And I mean, you even got high school athletes who are able to take advantage, especially those big kind of prize recruits who are able to take advantage of their kind of position as an athlete. And I mean, making six figures.
Yeah, so honestly, it's been crazy, just the speed and evolution, right? When that 2021 time frame, when NIL was being discussed, I mean, it was freaking everybody out because no one really knew what it was, right? Like most people don't understand what NIL actually is and how it's not tied to athletics in any way, shape, or form. When you truly
Good
break
point.
down NIL is a person's right of publicity and marketability,
Good
not
point.
because of their athletic ability. It's just every person's individual right to that. So there was very much this essence of like, okay, the whole point is keeping it separate, right? Like a kid wants to monetize their NIL, that's fine, they can do that. But like the school athletics, that's not part of the conversation. But we all know it kind of is. None of the initial questions, because I was at North Carolina at the time, none of the initial questions were about, collectives. That wasn't even a thing. Like no one even asked that question. Like nobody thought that was going to evolve to what it has today with recruitment. And we'll dive into that a little bit later. So the attention, I think, was really just about, you've got an offensive lineman at Marshall who was a country music singer that couldn't book gigs because he just happened to play offensive line, or the artist at Wisconsin who was a volleyball player who couldn't start her own art studio because she was a volleyball player, right? So the purity behind it was to allow student athletes the same opportunities that other students had in regards to entrepreneurship, marketability, value creation. Never, hey, I'm gonna have a collective pay a kid $1 million to come to school here. Not part of it, the essence. And then the unique piece, you touched on it briefly, but once the college level became, and this is where I started to kind of decide where I wanted to be in the educational space. I got really nervous sitting in those meetings at UNC thinking about, oh my God, this is coming to high school, right? Like this, you're not going to stop it. The trickle down always occurs. And most people don't realize, like right now, we have 40 state public school associations that permit NIL activity for high school student athletes, right? Like I just talked to a state association director who didn't know there were that many. You've got schools that aren't part of state associations. You've got states that have a public association and a private association. You've got 40 different policies. So the NCAA tried to maintain one policy and couldn't do it. And now you've got 40 different ones at the high school level. I mean, potentially more, and no one understands any of them, right? So part of that evolution, it's almost like the ball rolling down the hill, and like it's getting bigger, but you don't know which path it's going to choose or which slope it's going to go down. That's going to increase in I mean, just the massive, because I feel like once it hits it, it's just like on hyperdrive, right?
Yep.
Which, to your point about the collectives, I think there was a statistic on year two. Collectives weren't really in the game, right? You saw the brands come into play in the beginning. You saw this spike of, the restaurants and these people starting to kind of stick their feet into it. And then that kind of leveled off about halfway through year one. And then you started the donors and the boosters and the collectives. And I think year two, it was about 75% of all NIL activity at the college level was through collectives, right? So like taking over the marketplace, which predominantly is what you hear about right now, which is part media, part everything else. But there's so many nuances and slices to it that it's just this massive thing that it can be hard to understand.
So I want to follow up, and then Nick, I'll throw it over to you and let you get in your questions. But when you're talking with parents and parents of high schoolers, what are you telling them? Because I'm sure there's a branding aspect to it, and
For
hey,
sure.
again, it's America. Get what you can get. God bless you. But at the same time, I mean, now we're seeing stories of, hey, well, these people didn't pay me, and you come to find out, well, all we had was a handshake agreement.
Mm-hmm.
There's or they didn't read their contract, and hey, you're not doing your 10 social media posts, so we're not going to pay you. And I got to think, if I'm a coach, I'm like, I don't want to deal with this stuff. Don't call
Right.
me upset because my running back did 8 posts and not 10. So what is some of the information that like parents need to know and athletes need to know before they get into these deals?
Yeah, so absolutely. Number one, and it's kind of different, when you're working with high school student athletes and even down to junior high, and like there was a 9-year-old the other day that signed with an NIL representation agency, right? Like nine, like state high school athletic associations don't even cover 9-year-olds, right? That's not even part of the equation, but it's always about understanding safety and compliance of the regulations, right? Because at the high school level, what you don't ever want to happen is a kid enter into an NIL agreement that he or she unknowingly violates their amateurism status, their ability to participate on their high school team. Nobody wants that, right? Nobody is out. Every state association I work with, nobody's like, oh yeah, we're going out to get these kids, right? There's also an understanding where you have financial and tax implications. You have legal implications, as in a kid's a minor under the age of 18, right? Like they can't enter into legally binding contracts. I had a situation in a state where a company reached out to a kid on Instagram, asked him to send a picture to be an ambassador, and the kid did it. And the parents, they never vetted the company. It wasn't even a real company, right? So you have people taking advantage of the space and the increasing viability. So it's really about safety and compliance at the high school level. It's also about, and this is why I got so passionate When I started Triple Threat in 2017, I'm educating kids on positive social media use and personal branding. Now everybody wants to talk about it, but they talk about it in terms of NIL.
Mhm.
That's not what we're doing here, right? Like we're still teaching kids how to use these tools correctly for their life. So that's all of these things kind of roll into it. And when then I transition to helping schools from that perspective, it's like, how are you taking the life skills that kids need to understand, taxes, legal components, social media, personal branding, and integrating those into the classes that you already are teaching, right? Most high schools require financial literacy. Do a project on a terrible NIL contract and help them figure it out, right? The kid who signed 15% of his NFL earnings away for 25 years for a lump sum payment of
Yeah.
$200,000, right? Like just do the analysis in class and kids are going to be like, that was stupid, right? So using this national phenomena as a teaching tool, like for me, that is educational based athletics to a T, right? Safe, compliant, educational focus. Now at the college level, especially for kids that are recruits, et cetera, I mean, you got to understand what some of these collectives and boosters are trying to do, right? They don't love you more than they love the team in which they just created this entity to support. So when they say, I'm going to pay you $100,000 and there has to be an exchange of services, that's the one thing people don't realize. Like, I can't just pay you $100,000. Like, you're going to have to do something. Now, it may be something that isn't necessarily fair market value for what I'm asking you to do, but there is a quid pro quo. But if they're not offering you a contract and saying like here's when you're going to get paid, here's how much you're going to get paid, like it's always amazing to me when I talk to a coach who loses a recruit to a school that offered a larger NIL deal, and like the coach will talk to the kid and like there is no contract, and the coach is like, what are you talking about? Like they can offer you a contract, they can, that's part of the game now, but there are still people who are taking these people at their word, similar to the UNLV situation, if that is all true.
Right.
I mean, that kind of recruiting has been going on for years. Now they just can throw dollar amounts. Like I always tell people, if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true unless it's in writing in front of you. Bottom line.
All right, I'll jump in. So I've talked to, compliance directors and different things, and the consensus was that the original plan, which you mentioned earlier, that you just treat them like every other student, they have the same opportunities, exchange of service. If I have 1 million followers on Instagram, I can do a sponsored post just like any other student on my campus. Like that's great. Now we're to basically pay to play. Every O-lineman or every player at Utah gets a car just for being on the team, these types of deals, right? So when I look at the high school side of things, it's very different, in my opinion, because obviously there's less opportunity. But realistically, when my students ask me, how do I get, we're at a small college, how do I get an NIL deal? And I ask, how many followers do you have? Because you're not famous enough and our school's not famous enough just to pay you to be here. So like it goes back to the old school way of thinking, how much value can you provide a company? Which
Right.
was, again, what it was intended to be, right? Companies use you as part of their marketing plan. But for high schoolers, there's limited value there and limited opportunity, I think, compared to the college level. What really is the difference from the before times, let's say 10 years ago, where if I was a high school football player, somebody could, with 1 million followers, somebody could just pay me as long as I wasn't wearing anything sports related, right? Like it couldn't be tied, protect my amateurism. But like, how has that changed from 10 years ago as a high school athlete that maybe, again, because they're not really getting paid to play the way that college athletes are.
Right. Right.
So how has that really changed from what it was like before for anybody in high school being offered money to do something like that?
Yeah, so I mean, you have it, and again, it's different in states. And here's the thing about high school, and this is one thing that I always kind of tell people. High schools are unique because you have the majority of your supporters and your donors and the people that love your school within a 30-mile radius. Colleges, you often don't, right? You're relying on usually some big fish from a financial standpoint, right? So if I went to a really small school in Northwest Ohio, right? Basketball was king. There was a kid when I was fourth grade. His name was Matt Olds, and the guy was a stud, right? If Matt Olds got paid right now by Clubhouse Pizza downtown to do an appearance on a Saturday morning, every single kid in that town is going to show up with their little terrible towel that we got that said Continental Pirates, and he would sign it. It would be booked. Sometimes the local proximity and the support of high school students, athletes in general, and you have different types of activating athletes. We can talk about that a little bit. But for that kid, he was the all-American kid in our hometown, right? His opportunity, the value that he creates is a little bit different because he can engage in different ways. For colleges, you've got to get really clear on what is the value that I provide. I think the first kid to ever monetize their NIL was a volleyball player at Aquinas College in Michigan, a Division III college. During COVID, she got bored. She started creating DIY like videos on TikTok
I
and
remember that.
amassed millions of followers, right? Like nobody knows if she's any good at volleyball. Nobody cares, right? She had found a niche that was important to her. I think at the high school level, you have the 2% elite athletes. You've got the kid in Georgia who's got $1 million valuation, the quarterback. You've got oh gosh, what's his name in Louisiana? He just threw for like 700 yards, 800 yards, signed with Leaf Trading Company. He's a freshman football player, signed with like a 6-figure, 7-figure deal. I think it's Peyton. Oh, I'm gonna have to look it up. But you have those types of kids. Then you have kids that have some sort of unique attribute. So a lot of times when you look at high school NIL, it's usually tied to something unique that happened, a unique attribute they have, or a family sort of connection. So the gymnast in Tennessee who signed with her uncle's insurance agency. And it's important to understand, other than the 2%, the majority of NIL activity at the high school level and even at the college level, I think the average is $70, right? So like a lot of these kids aren't getting massive financial compensation. They're getting opportunity, they're getting percentages off of or discounts, they're getting gift in kind. So it can look a lot of it different. I think when you talk with students who are either interested in figuring out how to monetize, it's like you go back to that question, like what's important to you? What are your values? How does that align with a certain organization? There was a kid from Amherst College named Jack Betts who had like over 30 plus deals. And he said he had created almost like a cover letter that clarified his value to organizations to be involved with. That's how kids, a lot of times, other than the 2%, evolve into this space. So the high school level looks a lot of different ways. And usually I always tell people, you have no idea what it's going to look like in your school. I coach high school basketball right now. It wouldn't surprise me if like a kid came out and said, in Ohio doesn't permit it, but like the 15th man on the bench of the basketball that never like plays a second, but like has figured out how to create an online YouTube channel that's impactful and is like, oh yeah, that kid signed an NIL deal. Like what? Like that kid? Right? Because it's totally different. It's not what you're seeing at the college level. And there's so many uniqueness elements to it that it can just look a lot of different ways.
Talk about how do the state laws impact this, because they're different everywhere. When the Supreme Court overruled or basically affirmed the Alston decision, I feel like now it's up to the states to kind of figure out what it is they want to do and how is that impacting recruiting, or is it even impacting recruiting at this point?
Yeah, and again, I am not a lawyer, but when I look at all of these pieces, right? So I think at first, legislators kind of in different states, depending on how aggressive they wanted to be, but like some of them just got mad at the NCAA and just said like, all right, screw you guys. Like we're going to do something on our own. I was literally just reading an article about Missouri. So Missouri state legislators, I think they were the first state that passed within their state law that allowed student athletes that were high school student athletes to monetize if they were signed. It was a weird in way they wrote it too. They didn't have to sign a national letter of intent. It was just almost like you had to sign some sort of like financial agreement. They could start monetizing while they were in high school if they had signed with a school in state, right? Or the coaches at the college level could help facilitate and solicit deals if their kid was in state, right? So there were like these nuances that specifically only helped Missouri, right? And then there was, I think Virginia then looked at that. So you started to see legislators shift and change. Some legislators added in state laws about agents, right? So they were adding pieces in about, hey, you can't be agent representation unless you are certified by the state. Some states have that, not all. But then some people are saying, well, you're just trying to make money off of that certification. You're not really making them do something. They just have to, kind of like when you start a business, right? Oh, you pay your money, you pick a name, you're good to go. So there's different ways in which, and I think that's the hardest part. A lot of people would say when the NCAA was struggling and states were kind of taking it on their own to do what they wanted to do. It's like if you have rules and you don't enforce them, you don't have rules. So to them, it's like, all right, well, in the state of Alabama, this is important to us, or in the state of Missouri, this is important to us. And let's face it, college athletics is a big deal. And they're often, I guess this is a generality, I don't think you would be hard pressed to find a legislator in a state that was had a high affinity to a state sport team that they want to do whatever they could to support and move them forward. Right. I mean, I lived in North Carolina for a couple of years, and like, I think if UNC or NC State said like, hey, we're getting crushed on the recruiting trail because of this, I mean, again, that's not their job and that's not part of it. But I would say there are a lot of those conversations happening behind closed doors. Like, you got to help us. You got to figure this out, because let's face it, when you're at that level, Division One, you don't win, you're gone. You're gone. And NIL is a massive part of building rosters that win nowadays. So the state law piece can get really tough, because that's an additional nuance, right? Where now you have kids who potentially are coming into school from one state, going to school in a different state, potentially doing an NIL agreement with a company out of another state, right? So like now you've got tax implications. You've got, well, is that allowed in this state but not that state? Or there's just so many pieces to this where, like, for someone to truly educate themselves, like, you've got to be clear on what are you trying to find out, because there's just too much.
So what's the appetite, do you think, for a federal NIL law? From the feedback, or from what me reading, trying to read the tea leaves, I don't think it's something necessarily Congress wants to touch, because I think it's a thorny type of subject. But on the other side, you could say, hey, let's just pass a law and it'll be uniform, and then all these issues go away.
Yeah. I think the hard part with that is there are so many lawyers now engaged in NIL at a lot of different levels where, does this violate antitrust? Does that not? Does, the House versus the NCAA, which is going on right now? Like, I mean, you know how long it takes to do any of this stuff. Like, even there, by the time it actually comes into play, it's outdated because this thing is moving so fast. So I don't see that happening. I also think, and a lot of my research was always on, again, high school sports, but education is something that the national government has always just said, all right, states are in control of their education. Well, as long as athletics is still involved in education, I don't see them stepping in and saying like, oh yeah, we're now going to take control of this environment, right? Where I don't see them crossing that bridge, because that is a big bridge to cross. I think the NCAA wanted it. I think that's why some of those pieces and players became involved. I think that's a road that a lot of people aren't going to be willing to go down. And with everything else happening in our country right now, I just don't know. I wouldn't bank on that one.
I know that at the college level, they would love, well, I don't want to say they, the compliance officers would love just a black and white, tell us what's okay and what's not, because they're stuck between, sure, are we okay with this? Maybe, maybe not, but we're not even sure what's allowed, what's not allowed sometimes. Like it's just a lot of gray area, and you never want to be in that situation as a compliance officer.
Yeah.
Are you eligible? Are you not? Will this change something? I mean, like you said, it changes every day. They would love nothing more than for Congress, but they, at least the compliance officers I talk to are lawyers, and they say they're not going to touch it.
Yeah.
because what's the motivation there to
Right.
create more work? And like
And
you said,
compliant.
yeah,
Yeah. And compliance is so hard because it's interpretation based, right? So like, and you know compliance officers, they're great people. Some interpret things differently than others at different schools with different administrators, with different coaches, with I mean, we at UNC it was awesome. We had an amazing compliance department and we would have like weekly sessions and they would like run you through these examples and you're like what? Like, I mean, it's like they were talking a different language, right? And that was before NIL, let alone now. It's like, I mean, I don't, that's just a really, really hard thing to try to define if there is no black and white, but I don't think they're ever going to get the black and white.
So Scott, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do with your company, Triple Threat Leadership. You know, you're going out, you're speaking to athletic associations, state athletic associations, you're speaking to high schools. You know, what are some of the things you're doing to help prepare student athletes for NIL?
Yeah, so Triple Threat Leadership has a couple verticals. A long time ago we started social media education, personal branding. On the NIL education component, we run a website called nil-education.com. We specifically focus all of our resources on supporting high schools, and we do it in a different way. Stakeholders, we do not cross over into the monetization realm, right? Our goal is 100% to help people understand policies from a safety, compliance standpoint moving forward. We have an NIL prep kit, which is the only really written resource about helping high school stakeholders understand NIL. I travel to a lot of schools and do NIL education presentations specific to their state policy. I mean, we go line by line. Like, here's what this means. Here are leadership questions that you would have. I do a lot of work with state associations. I do a lot of work with state athletic director associations who bring me into their conferences and we walk through, again, if they're a state that doesn't allow it yet, hey, here are the policies around the country and here are some things to consider. If it passes, here are some things that you need to ask of the state association, just helping them lead a little bit more proactively moving forward. We have two partnerships. One with the Georgia High School Athletic Association, then one with the Colorado High School Athletic Association, which I was just had a conference call with a lot of their ADs earlier. They're just trying to learn because they're in the same space of misunderstanding, misinformation, so much all over the place. So for me, we do a lot of support on that backside. We have online recordings, we have a class, we have a lot of different resources to help people in the life cycle of where they're kind of at. And then the greatest part is when the school then decides, how do we integrate life skill development within our educational offerings that supports this kind of just understanding that I don't take a stance. I don't say this is good or bad, but it's not going away. So using it as an educational based resource is something that I think I try to help get high school administrators to, instead of just saying, hey, this is awful. I'll help you write a policy that isn't that bad, right? We can figure this out and support moving forward. So we do a lot of that kind of support in ensuring we are on the safety compliant school stakeholder side, and not, hey, I'm here to help your kids monetize. I'm going to take part of that's not what we do in any way, shape, or form.
Well, that education component, so important. I mean, fits in well with the show that we have here, kind of being to sport management professors, sport leadership professors, on what it is that we want to try to get our message across as far as education. Because it's easy. I think anytime I hear NIL, it's easy to come on and either kind of bemoan it and just kind of, just complain, or champion it. But I think when you get down to the meat, I think there's a lot of, again, kind of unintended consequences that have kind of boiled to the surface. But how can we, start to head some of that stuff off at the pass? So it's good to see that people like yourself are out there doing that. So,
and to add on to that, not to get, but like especially for professors that are at Division II and Division III schools, I think there's a large opportunity right now, because to the point of what we were kind of talking about, I think Division I athletics is almost to a point of no return, right? Like it's going to become something that is not historically what college athletics has kind of been. I think Division II and Division III, some schools are going to say, you know what, that's not us. And I think a lot of sport management programs in those schools can integrate life skill development, can integrate the NIL support structure of not like, hey, here's how you monetize, but all the things that you try to do with your students every single day and still keep a little bit of that sanctity of college athletics that's not what that Division I level is turning into, because that's not NIL, right? That's Blue Chips the movie
Yep.
with just a kid having to do, I mean, they're giving tractors to people, right? Well, now that kid's just signing a football for the tractor, right? So I think it's a great, honestly, a great time for educators to utilize this national phenomena in a way to support all the things that we've been trying to do for a long, long time.
I can tell you're of a certain age if you're dropping Blue Chips
Yeah.
references, but I love it. It right up my alley there.
I always tell people, right? If you've ever seen that movie, like people are like, "Oh, that is blasphemy! I can't believe they're doing that." Like all of that stuff's illegal, right? Now the kid just has to do something in exchange for that, right? Like, you need a tractor, you need me to give you a car. Here you go. Like that's the crazy part when you actually think about it.
Old Ricky Rowe, Matt Nover
Oh,
from Indiana
I
University.
love it.
Nick, do you have anything, any other questions, any follow up you want to have, or I'm kind of interested. Do you have any athletes that you know of at Madonna who are taking advantage of NIL? Because I can't think of any at Trine, except maybe I think one kid got a Moe's gift card.
Well, yeah, not in the D1 sense, right? Like
Yeah.
we've talked about, mainly in that truer sense of, the question is, what's your brand? How many followers you have? And so, yeah, we do have a couple of students that came in with pre-existing social media followings and have turned those into some sponsored deals.
Mhm.
But realistically, it has nothing to do with like, even if they weren't an athlete, they'd be eligible for these things. And so that's what it was intended to do, is just not be punitive for people that happen to be an athlete. But these deals that they have nothing to do with being an athlete. Like they are strictly like, they are influencers.
Yep. Yep. And I think, when you look at the data and those types of things, and honestly, there's not a lot of data. We just launched the high school research pool just for high school data, but I think it's anywhere between like 75 and 90 of all NIL activity is social media promotion based, right?
Mm.
So most of the kids now, that's where all of that is kind of falling when you take out the 2%, right? Like again, you almost have two different conversations, NIL for the 2%, NIL for the other 98%. And it's not a bad thing, but I think you're going to see some of what you're talking about with these kids now who are going into college that have had social media so long and are influencing in different ways. I think a lot of NIL activity is moving to cause focus elements. I think a lot of high schools are considering how do we engage in NIL activities with alumni that have large brands to impact our current bottom line. I think that's a great thing to teach people. So a lot of ways that you can cut and slice it and will look unique moving forward.
Excellent. Well, Scott, appreciate you so much for being on the show here.
Always.
And if people want to follow along with your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Mr. Grant 1161. You can tripleThreatLeadership.com. My cell phone, my email, everything is always there. If you call me, I'll answer. So if I can help in any way as anyone's moving forward trying to learn more about this, I'm always here. And I appreciate you guys having me on. I love this stuff.
Well, fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Scott. Appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed any of our episodes and have an idea for a future episode or a guest that you would like to see, or if you have a question for us, feel free to just email us, which we'll put our contact info in the description of the video and the podcast, or go ahead and just leave a comment, and we will check every single comment because there's not many of them yet. So we're still happy to do that.
I will say we did have like one or two.
Yes,
great
we did.
feedback, and I did get a message. I got a message from an old colleague of mine who listened to the show, which is really great. So Carter, thank you. But he graduated from West Virginia University. I don't know, in the 80s or 70s. Sorry, Carter. But he worked, I think, for their broadcast team. And we were talking about baseball and how I just didn't care if we won or lost, just don't go into extras. And he thought that was funny because he was like, same thing on the broadcast side. So,
well, games don't mean that much when you have over 100 of them, right?
Well, you're talking to a Cubs fan. So those losses, doggone it, in May and June, They count
late
at the end of the
season
year,
every
and I'm not
game is
happy.
a lot more impactful, right? But
But
you know,
this
as a
this is not
Tigers
an opinion
fan
show.
who skated into the playoffs, yeah, they had a segment on a local radio show that asked, "Did the Tigers ambush your fall plans?" Because we were all checked out. Nobody was watching anymore. Nobody thought could possibly win, and we were at like 0.1% chance of making the playoffs. And then boom, not only that, won a couple games in the playoffs. So yeah, I appreciate that. So keep the comments coming. Please reach out. Give us guest ideas. I know soon we'll be having the commissioner of Cosmo, which will be great. Talk on accreditation, working with some people from an NIL collective to get that perspective and why they do and what they do. So it should be a fun fall here. So keep coming with keep emailing us, texting us, tweeting at us. LinkedIn seems to be a popular one for us. So just keep giving us ideas and we'll keep running with them.
All right. It was another great episode. Appreciate it, Nick. See you on the next one.
Yep. Thanks, Pod. See ya.